In the collective failure that is my inability to get this panel ready, I was told, or at least I thought, that there was going to be a student introducing the panelists, but I am doing the introductions instead. So guess what? You're all going to get very truncated introductions. Jennifer Warren is here to join us from Lockheed Martin. She has a very fancy vice president, regulatory and something else title. Literally, I don't have any of this stuff in front of me, but it's on the screen for you guys. Lynna McGrath with us from NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management, which I just maligned on our previous panel, so I'm sure she's really going to be happy to see me moderating on this one. And Dan Baker from the University of Colorado. We are going to jump right in because unlike what you heard right before the lunch, I feel like starting with a John Cleese quote and now for something completely different, I think we're going to have some contrary opinions on this panel. So I'm just going to jump right in and we'll start with the broad, and I'll start with Lynna because you're right next to me. From a US policy standpoint, like what's the most pressing government challenge that you're facing in the Office of Spectrum Management right now?
Probably balancing the needs of everyone who wants spectrum access. So we're sitting here and we're talking about space. How many folks work in the space economy and need access to spectrum? I'm seeing no hands.
Yeah, so if you don't put your hands up, you've waived your right to spectrum later.
So we've got this growing, increasing demand for access for space systems. We have this growing, increasing demand for spectrum for satellites or for terrestrial systems. Anna got asked the question earlier today on mid-band spectrum and the impact on satellite. We've now seen two worlds collide. So if you look at what's being teed up for mid-band and what's being studied in the ITU, Agenda Item 1.7, looking at additional spectrum for IMT, 5G, 6G, for those of you who don't speak ITU, bands that are teed up include bands that are used for satellite. So are we going to take spectrum away from satellite companies and give it to terrestrial? That's a question. So we keep having this growing demand for everyone. As I keep joking, I've seen the enemy and the enemy is myself. How many mobile connected devices do you have on your person right now?
Very few of you are going to say one, let's be honest. Dombrowski, you're throwing off the curve.
So it's one of them of, we're all having this incredibly increasing demand for additional commercial services. We've got all of this we want to do. We all want to be wireless. We want self-driving cars. We like it when our car beeps at us and tells us, hey, there's somebody in your blind spot, don't pull into them. We like it when we get accurate weather forecasts. All that stuff requires spectrum. So we've got this incredible increasing demand and no additional supply. So how do we find the balance across all of the users, both federal and non-federal, to meet everything we want to do? So that's probably our biggest challenge.
Yeah, not surprising that that's your biggest challenge. I think we heard a little bit about that on the earlier panels, and the answer has always been, right, of course we'll take from satellite and give to terrestrial because that was the way the ratchet went, and it seems that things are starting to maybe turn the other direction. I guess we'll have to see. Dan, your work has focused on the proliferation of satellites. And so from that regulatory perspective, what are you seeing as the biggest challenge of the proliferation of satellites?
Yeah, in a classic paper in Science magazine in 1968, Garrett Hardin talked about the tragedy of the commons. Individuals acting rationally and in their own self-interest will deplete a common resource, even if it hurts the group as a whole. And that's what really concerns me, is that I don't know how many satellites the system can bear, but I know as a scientist, it's having a tragic effect on astronomy, it's affecting radio astronomy. What is really concerning is the possibility of collisions that will make an entire region of the space unusable. So it's a $400 billion plus industry, and it's essentially the Wild West. And Commissioner Gomez talked about some different models. It could be self-regulation, everybody does the right thing, maybe. Maybe there could be national leadership, and that would be the US at this point taking leadership and setting the tone for others. Or it could be some body like the United Nations. The United Nations has disavowed its interest in enforcing or establishing real rules. They'll just be a source of transmitting information from one group to another. So that's my big concern is what process is put in place in order to regulate and to assure that we don't end up with a large region of space that's essentially unusable.
It's great. Jennifer, your company actually builds orbital satellites and helps get them up into orbit. So maybe you could give us a little taste of what, from Lockheed's perspective, you're seeing as challenges and opportunities in the current congested environment.
So I'm just going to take it in a slightly different.
Listen, I knew no matter what I asked you, Jennifer, you were going to answer the question you wanted me to ask. So that's great.
Yeah. So glad we got that. So thank you though for having me anyway. So I think one of the challenges that's out there is one that I don't disagree with anything that folks have said, but it goes back, how do we make the US the best place to be licensed and going forward? And that is getting rid of some uncertainties. And there's been an uncertainty that I think, unlike some of these issues where industry is divided, there's an uncertainty where industry has not been divided, and that is with respect to implementation of Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. And where does supervisory authority for activities in space reside? We know where the RF authority resides. We know where the launch...
Hey, Jennifer, you want to elaborate on Article 6 for the law students?
Article 6 requires that state parties to the Outer Space Treaty exercise supervisory and, it's not the right word, regulatory authority over activities in outer space that are basically performed under the national administration's licensing. And since probably President Obama, industry has reached out with seeing all the new cool in-space activities that were coming, whether ISAM, which has already been defined, or any of the other really cool new activities that are taking place in space. So where do we go for that, what we call mission authorization? And that still is an open question. Despite all the leadership and all the success, and I think the word was dominance, right, that Adam used, still, that's an open issue that creates uncertainty. So industries have been able to work around that, and we've gotten, the FAA to step in. At times, the FCC's been willing to step in, but there's been no clear representation of where that authority resides. There was, the last administration came out with a proposal for human activities in space to be regulated by the FAA and non-human by commerce. There was a completely different approach that was being floated in legislation. We're still sitting here without that clarity. And when you want to get a mission authorization, so you as a commercial entity know you're covered and deemed in compliance with the provision that every country in the world that signed it, which is a lot, recognize, you're kind of sitting there. So I think that's an area where it would be really helpful for that predictability and certainty for us to be able, as a country, to move forward. But that requires everybody working together, Hill, executive branch, and industry.
Lynna, the Department of Commerce is obviously, as Jennifer pointed out, a player in this space and has a role in here. What have you been seeing in terms of the way that the department has been trying to change processes to address the concerns that we get things done and get things in orbit faster? Have you seen a process change at all in the last couple of years?
So I think one of them, and as Jennifer alluded to, there's been a lot of conversation of who's responsible for what. So in Department of Commerce, we have the Office of Space Commerce, which is in NOAA, because that makes...
Oh, is it back in NOAA now?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That makes perfect sense. We put Space Commerce in NOAA. So they're working on, as the previous panel mentioned, they're taking over responsibility for the coordination and tracking of existing space systems. So we have that going on. I'm trying to work on that, but it is challenging of trying to figure out who's responsible for what. And it would, from a federal government perspective, providing some clarity of what's in whose job jar, such that we're not stepping on each other's toes or running into the situation of someone develops rules and then gets taken to court and has it thrown out, goes straight back to that predictability and certainty piece. So I think there's a lot of work being done. I know in OSM, we're really focused on, as Adam alluded to, trying to fix the satellite coordination process. for as different companies come through and want to access federal or shared spectrum. We can make that process smoother. That's an ongoing effort to figure out how to do that. So there are things we're doing, but it would be nice if we got some direction from the administration and the Hill of what falls in whose job jar, such that we have direction on the federal side of where we need to go.
Jennifer, from the commercial perspective, right, are the space traffic management efforts that have been made, is industry getting what it needs at the timing, or is industry simply filling the gaps that exist in the government's current portfolio?
So yes and yes. So I think TRACS and the Space Data Association as well, which a lot of industry, US operators in particular like, does fill the gaps and does start to pick up what DoD is transitioning out of. But one of the challenges that, because even though we have so many of the next generation satellite operators coming out of the United States, there are still lots, as was discussed on prior panels, coming from a lot of other countries. And there is a sensitivity that a US-based TRACS-like entity may not be where some countries want to share some of their data, their ephemeris data that will tell the US government where their satellites may be, depending upon the mission of that satellite or that constellation. So there's a question about, particularly for the full picture of the value of TRACS, how do you then globalize that? How do you get operators who might not want to share with a US entity that data? What sort of neutral environment can there be? Is that, and I'm not picking one, I'm just throwing out, right? Is that an ITU? Is that some sort of NGO? What kind of model is that? So whether it's the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, the Indians, the Brazilians, everybody will want to share that, because as we've talked about before, this is a commons in the sense that there are no lanes, there's no sovereignty, constellations are flying, doesn't matter what flag you're flying. So, but that ephemeris data and other data is really relevant. So how do you create that environment? So I think everything the US is doing is very important, but taking it to that next level that it's truly globalized is something I think that we still need to focus on as a country.
And do you think that's, given that space is actually a warfare domain, do you think that's even possible?
I think it's possible to do more than we are doing today. It doesn't mean that ephemeris data from every system will show up into that database, but more will come than perhaps will come today.
It's fair.
At least I was just on a call yesterday with operators on this topic, so I know it continues to be a concern globally.
Yep. Dan, from your perspective, is the data that's out there in terms of the amount of what's in orbit in terms of both space traffic management and in terms of debris mitigation, do you think where are the gaps that you're seeing from an academic perspective that are not being met by either government or by the private sector?
Well, I would say that there's a lot that we know and a lot we don't know. And, we know the larger objects, but all it takes is one major storm to disrupt the knowledge about what's there. The earlier panels have talked very interestingly about what's necessary in order to deal with the increasingly crowded space. And I think I agree with the things that were said before, that we need to have better knowledge about where things are. We have to have better precision for that kind of information and all. But my question, I guess, is whether that's coming along rapidly enough. The source function is increasing exponentially. We're getting more and more things in space. I think that's going to, maybe that's the theme I'll hit repeatedly here, is that's just getting to be too crowded and too dangerous. And we're one major catastrophe away from, making things really, really bad. And so I think from an academic standpoint, we need to increase all the techniques that have been talked about. We need to make sure that we provide more information for operators. We need to have more alerts. But there's so many things in space that can't move, that can't get out of the way. I think there's a real danger lurking here, and I hope, from my point of view, somebody's got to step up and take leadership. I think the United States got to do that. I agree with the points made here that we need to get government agencies to understand what their roles and missions are, and then take those seriously and seek to get the rest of the world to line up behind us.
Can I just add one
Absolutely.
other thing? And this keeps coming up, and Kim Baum, I'm going to give credit to for always raising it in bilats, but it continues to come up. Something as simple as a contact list, right? For operators to know whether it's IMing someone, texting them, phoning them, not emailing, but about collision questions or issues. That is missing. Something as simple as that. And having something where you start to create, we go back to kind of culture, the lady from the humanities, right? The culture of connecting on something as simple. Space has always been kind of above, in many ways, tensions around the world in a lot of ways. And so creating that connection between operators and having a contact point that survives change, retirements, and what have you, so that operators develop that familiarity is another way to create a safer environment for more and more investment. Because let's face it, it's about cool things, but it's also about a safe place for investment.
Yeah, like all of the cool areas, it's the mundanities of literally, do you have somebody to talk to that actually drive the advancement. I'm going to take us from low Earth orbit, and I'm gonna try and be like the Apollo program. I'm going to take us a little further out and around the moon and maybe back if I do it right. So I wanted to move away from sort of the shell right around the Earth and talk a little bit about governance around objects that are near Earth but not part of Earth. And so let's talk about resources and gathering resources in outer space. And Jennifer, I think this might be a good one for you to start with. Look, we have, obviously we have the Outer Space Treaty, which talks about the ownership of objects in outer space. We also have various countries around the world deciding that they're going to put mineral rights laws on the books. From an industry perspective, how do you navigate sort of that particular challenge, and what should we be doing to square the circle?
So a few things. Obviously, you're not appropriating land on the moon. You're extracting, which is a little different. And if you look at, I'll go back to the reference to UNCLOS earlier. UNCLOS is a really great cross-reference when you look at ocean minerals, right? You get licenses for extraction of minerals from the deep seabed in international waters. Doesn't give any entity title or sovereignty over that area. All it does is create a right to not be disturbed in the activity, the specific activity that you're undertaking. I think there's a great analogy between how you could look at asteroid mining or any other resource acquisition, if you draw from that and how that's been implemented, at least in concept through the International Seabed Authority's implementation of Part 8.
Lynna, we don't get out there and get to the moon without having access to spectrum resources beyond orbit. I know a lot has been discussed about lunar spectrum and cislunar spectrum. Maybe you could give the crowd a little bit of a primer on what's happening and where things are headed with spectrum governance in those spaces.
Sure. So it's one of them of, I think we keep joking in the ITU, it's not when the first country lands on the moon, it's when the second one gets there that we're going to have problems. So right now there's several conversations going on within the ITU. There's an agenda item for for WRC 27, 1.15, which starts looking at lunar spectrum. So what are the requirements for lunar spectrum communications, PNT, all that sort of stuff? We're going to need that on the moon. So what are the initial requirements that we need, but then also that item has in there of what's the appropriate framework we should be using for this. There's been conversations in the ITU about adding ITU Region 4. So if folks aren't familiar with the ITU, we've broken the world down into 3 different regions. We've got the Pacific, kind of Europe and Africa, and then we got Region 2, the Americas. Creating ITU Region 4, which would be lunar. So you had those conversations of, is this something we should be doing? And then it gets down into the whole thing of the ITU is not an enforcement mechanism. It relies on the sovereignty of the nations to basically do their own spectrum management. So who does that for the moon? So we've got a lot of these things going on of earlier panel of it's the, right now by ITU definition, anything in space is considered a space station. So if you have say a rover on Mars, it is considered a space station. As we're starting to get into building out kind of ecosystems further outside of the Earth and its orbits, what should we be doing? And how do we regulate this? And that's a lot of the conversations that are going on right now. Like I said, it's not when the first country gets there, it's when the second one gets there. We get number 3, and that's when we start having these conflicts. So there's a lot of conversations going on, and I have a feeling that this is going to be a recurring agenda item for Lord knows how many upcoming WRCs to figure this out, because the problem is going to get here sooner than we think. And we'll see if we can get the regulations in front of it or if we're playing catch up.
Who besides the United States are the players in this game right now at the ITU?
So in a lot of cases, and one of the things that's different, I think we're seeing a change in how lunar is approached, is it used to always be science, and it was being done by the different nations. Now we've got private companies getting involved in this. So we've seen Japan has tried to do lunar landers. We've got India is working on lunar landers. China obviously is trying to go to the moon. So we've got a whole bunch of different countries involved in this. But the thing that's actually been kind of fun working in kind of the space science area is, amazingly, for the most part, those countries work well together. So there is I call it a coalition of the willing. Many of the world space agencies get together as a part of what's called the Space Frequency Coordination Group, SFCG, and work through these issues. So there actually is an existing lunar frequency plan using existing allocations from the Earth. Where do we have space research and space operations allocations that could be put forward for use in lunar? How do we line those up to ensure that we don't have two countries trying to ask for the same frequency and have overlaps? Yes, we have had spectrum conflicts on Mars. So how do we get away from that? So right now it's kind of been this coalition of the willing, but that's been primarily national space agencies. We're now bringing in the private sector, which is interested in getting in operations here. So it's figuring out how to play in that. And it's one of them of, it's very interesting as you see a lot of the world geopolitics don't tend to play there. In those conversations, the US and Russia actually gets along really pretty well. China is a part of those conversations. They tend to be quieter, but they are there. We're not totally sure if they're going to adopt the SFCG approved frequency plan. From what we've seen, they may be going their own direction. But there has been discussion in trying to get this aligned, just kind of as that coalition of the willing. But as we get more people involved, more companies involved, it's going to need to expand and end up in some sort of probably regulatory framework to protect everyone's interests.
Could
Go
I
ahead,
add
Jennifer.
one dimension? Because it's really important. It's the opportunity side. So all of the companies that are trying to participate in what will be the lunar ecosystem, if you like, we're trying to take a lot of what's happening in digital technology development on Earth and see how to leverage that and use that on the moon so that we're not having to recreate things. So what we're seeing is we're trying to take terrestrial mobile technology, move it up to the lunar surface in the same band that they're actually optimized for here. So it creates some interesting confusion because the terrestrial mobile wireless sometimes thinks, well, wait, if it's going to be space, that's going to be in conflict with us. And we're like, you would have to have so many millions of terminals on the moon before you even see a blip on Earth that I would love to see the ecosystem evolve that quickly or in the next 20, 30 years. But we're talking about way far out, and your technologies, the terrestrial mobile technologies, will evolve maybe to another band by then, right? So we don't see the saturation of a band on the moon coming at the expense of anything on the Earth, but instead the OEMs, the terrestrial equipment manufacturers, will actually benefit because it'll be a new market for their technology optimized for the band that they've optimized here. So there's a lot of synergies that are between the two, space and terrestrial, that can really be manifested up there, so we don't have to export the spectrum wars, to use Jennifer Manner's book, to the moon. We can just keep them here on ground.
Dan, I'm going to turn to you briefly because I'm in a room that I'm painfully aware is full of astrophysicists who will
Well,
attack
not
me
full, but
if I don't bring up the radio astronomy issue, and I know it's an issue you care a lot about. So maybe you could pivot to radio astronomy and the impacts on them.
Yeah, but first, can I just comment on?
Go for it.
I want to have a lament here as a scientist. Things were a lot simpler in some ways when we had COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research. And this was an organization that dealt with state entities, space agencies. And really, even during the height of the Cold War, I guess people could still talk about things and work things out. And now, in this new world, things are much more contentious between state players, and there are many more players, private industry and so on. I don't think there's a similar kind of entity that really facilitates as much conversation as there needs to be. And I would like to hope and think that we could get back to a time when, no matter what the political differences, no matter what, that there's still enough self-interest that everyone would get together and work things out in a more peaceful and coherent way.
I mean, we could do an entire conference on should we have multilateral or multi-stakeholder governance of space, which is the topic you just teed up.
Yeah, I know this. We can get off into all kinds of things. Now, what were you asking me before?
I was asking. I was pivoting to some of the radio astronomy challenges of more and more radio use in space, in addition to what's happening on Earth.
And there's an interesting chart that was put together just looking at the effects of leakage from satellites, what that's doing to the radio astronomy bands. The radio astronomy signals may be 1/100th of a Jansky or something like that, and there are 100 or 1,000 Jansky kind of signals coming from operating spacecraft. It's just devastating, and these are occurring in the bands that are supposed to be clear for radio astronomy. So somebody's got to take charge of these things. Somebody's got to work with the offenders and try to figure out. And I think, again, I hope that Silicon Flatirons and maybe our new Space Policy Center can convene people to sit down in a room and to talk reasonably together about what's going wrong here, what technological solutions can we have. I don't see any way to get the genie back in the box on the proliferation of communication satellites and stuff. That's not going to happen. So how can we deal with the problems and still preserve radio astronomy and, for that matter, nighttime astronomy?
Yeah, space as a domain is certainly not immune from the challenges of how to address passive users that we experience on the terrestrial. I would throw up to the group if there's an idea amongst any of you about how to sort of strengthen the role or the voice of passive users in the governance model we have in a way that doesn't harm our space interests. I'm off script now, guys, so if they don't answer, it's okay.
It's a challenge, and you've got the radio astronomy folks, but when you talk passive, it's not just radio astronomy. Right. We do a lot of science measurements using passive sensing. So a lot of the data we get to go and feed into our weather models comes from passive sensing.
Right.
And those are bands that are under pressure. We see filings to the ITU which say the passive sensing bands are the biggest waste of spectrum that is out there. So you've got this tremendous pressure. We got a question earlier about there was a current FCC proceeding which is looking to put terrestrial service, or which is looking to put space services in an existing passive sensing band. So you've got this dynamic tension. As we noted, we're looking for more spectrum. What's available? You've got these bands that laws of physics say you can't move, but everyone wants to get tighter and tighter and tighter up against them. And it's a challenge. And with those, the big thing we're worried about is insidious interference. So it's not one of them of, you can look at it and go, that ain't right. So if you look outside and it says the temperature outside is currently 212 degrees, you know that's not right.
Pretty close. So.
You hope not. I mean, none of us are in DC right now, but it's pretty warm.
But what if it's off by 1%, 2%? You start getting these very slight increases into that data. That's now what we're feeding into, say, our weather models. What's the impact of that? So we've got this challenge of trying to do more with the existing spectrum we have, but protect some of these very critical uses that it's spectrum we don't auction, we don't sell commercial service in, but has tremendous value to the American public. So it's a challenge of how do we protect those, because it's difficult and we're trying to do a lot more with less, but make sure everything still works. And here's hoping technology continues to develop and we're able to do that, but it's a really hard challenge.
But that's what I think.
No, go ahead, no.
I was just going to say, that's what's great about having meetings of the sort that, Silicon Flatirons has organized, where you have lawyers, you have agency folks, you have scientists, you have engineers, you have, all the people who are affected, maybe intended and unintended consequences are looked at. And there's got to be, you got to recognize all the realities, but you have to find a path that minimizes the harm to all parties. And it's not going to be perfect for anyone, but it's going to make it a lot better.
So I think one of the challenges is there's no one that's willing to do an economic valuation of citizen services, right? What's the economic value of a service that services all of us at no subscription cost? I can't find an economist who wants to do that. If anybody here does, let me know. Thanks.
Good.
I will take us, on that note, I'll take us back out into orbit and pivot, because you brought it up a little bit ago, and we've talked a little bit about the sort of dichotomies that we're facing here, right? Like you said, Jennifer, earlier, everything, I think it was you, Jennifer, maybe it was you, Lynna, everything in space is a space station, right? And we treat everything in space like a space station. And Jennifer, you brought up in space assembly and manufacturing, which is presenting some unique questions about what do we do as we look at a governance model that looks at things with more strata than we currently do? How do we address the differences between human cargo and non-human cargo? And yes, I realize I just said human cargo. How do we look at things that are, let's be honest, they're cargo until they get up into orbit. Come on. And how do we deal with the fact that, right, we've always treated rocket stages like rocket stages? At what point does a rocket stage become a satellite? These are sort of all questions that are being tackled right now. Lynna, can you talk a little bit about what's being looked at in the government from that perspective?
See, that's a good question.
I mean, like, I realize I'm asking NTIA about an FCC proceeding, but like, the reality that the US government is starting to look at ISAM.
No,
right?
it's very much, we're starting to look at ISAM, and I think, and as it's kind of been said, ISAM covers such a broad range of different uses. So you have everything from manufacturing to developing or trying to do maintenance on satellites. So it's and they need spectrum for different purposes. So what is it? And I think one of the ongoing conversations we have is, well, what service class does that fall in? And going, this doesn't really fit any of them. And no one ever wants to open Article 1 at the ITU of definitions, because that is opening Pandora's box. But it's getting into that, where do these fit? And do they not fit in our existing allocation table, in our existing service classes? And if so, how do we treat them? And I think that's what the FCC's ongoing ISAM proceeding is. It's such a new and evolving economy, and it covers such a broad range of topics and broad ranges of uses that it's really hard to figure out where to go right now. I think it's so new. It's kind of how is this going to emerge? And I think that's the tack the commission is taking with this, is looking to see how does this economy continue to evolve. There's going to be different economic drivers. I love the person who said on the previous panel, economics gets the second to last vote, because it's very true. And I think it's going to be one of them what's the financial base, what's the economic drivers for the ISAM economy. And I think as you see space sustainability, if there's going to be space sustainability requirements that come in, is that going to push different portions of ISAM? So as you start to see how does this unfold from an economic perspective, I think that will help determine where we need to go, but it's still so early, it's really hard to tell.
Dan, you've done a lot of research on space debris and sort of the ISAM question that Lynna just teed up, like, what is this going to do to our sustainability question? How have you been looking at ISAM and what its impact might be going forward?
Well, let me answer the question sort of this way. I guess, I'm very excited about the possibility of, from the previous panel, of being able to reuse things, recycling, take materials there and use them for other purposes. That's very exciting. What worries me is that this is developing too slowly, and the source function is increasing exponentially, and the loss, the reduction is taking place too slowly. And I really believe that only government, I think, can really seed this adequately in order to move this, increase the pace of development in this arena. And again, the things we've heard about, some of the threats to government support are diminishing rather than increasing. So I'm just raising there are plenty of alarms being set off by many things, but I really think this is moving along too slowly. All the concepts of debris removal and reuse and so on are really not moving adequately, rapidly to deal with the problem that's developing in aerospace.
Jennifer, Lynna talked about this ISAM from a spectral perspective. I'm sure you have an opinion on that, but I'd also love if you could talk about from the vehicle perspective.
Yeah, so we've been active in this space going back a couple of years. We released an on-orbit docking standard, open, non-proprietary, but it's all driven by mission/use cases, right? Then I'm looking at my notes here because I want to remember, we've also done an in-space joining experiment at the ISS, International Space Station, though I know everybody knows that. So we're seeing demand signals. We're seeing mission use signals, if you like, use case signals. And I think one of the important things about what's happening at the FCC is it's leaning into this and trying to figure out how can it partner with industry, and whether it's meeting missions that might be coming from the government, but looking to source them on a commercial basis, as a commercial service offering, or for servicing within the commercial community. There's a couple of things, and while we really did welcome the ISAM proceeding, and I don't want to file an ex parte, so I'm not going to look at anybody here from the FCC. We did file comments actually that focus on a couple of key points that I'm going to bring up, which is how do you authorize this for maximum efficiency, right? We took the position, as did I think some others, that it ought to be authorized on an activity basis as opposed to focused on a customer, right? It's not the customer that's necessarily relevant unless for non-US customers, there may be security, export, other things that need to be taken into account. But it ought to be whether it's a space tug, whether it's a refuel, whether it's, fill in the gap, fill in the blank of what that ISAM service is, be authorized for that purpose. And then look at then how do you notify the FCC so they can share with the interagency teams what the specific client is that you're gonna then service. But you've got that general authority that you can build a business case around, right? It's not that each each client has to make that business case for that particular moment in time, you can have a broader business model. And that also goes to why it's so important to understand not only who's going to authorize the spectrum, but this is an in-orbit activity, not a through-orbit activity, but an in-space activity, and we go, hence the name. And we go back to the governance question under Article 6. Who is actually exercising supervisory authority on an ongoing basis? Right now, the proposal is for the FCC to be notified or licensing it on a client-by-client basis. Again, there's no designation of the FCC as a supervisory authority. Not clear that the executive branch wants to delegate it to an independent agency or an agency that's authorized by Congress. But you know, these are the things that we think have to be resolved, and the FCC is going in a good track. I think one other thing that I would say is with respect to the spectrum, while there may be no clear ISAM allocation, there is an opportunity to take a page from the wireless industry book, which is they do so much by identification. You don't have to recreate a category for something. So IMT, International
Mobile telecommunications.
Yeah, international mobile, that's it. Right, let's just come up with our own and let's move forward. That is the easy part to solve compared to the governance and liability from an authorizing perspective. So those would be my 2 cents.
Well, Jennifer, I'm going to follow up on that a little bit. Say, is there a country that's doing it right? I mean, we've talked a little bit about how, you talked about Article 6.
Not doing it wrong.
No, is there a country that's doing it better with more clarity than we are? Because we've talked a lot, on many of these panels, we've talked about the fact that space governance within the United States government has 16 different venues that you have to go to get through any particular process. And so is there a model in another country that we can draw some lessons from?
Well, I would say that most other countries aren't modeled the way we are in terms of space and spectrum regulation. So I think it's really hard unless we were to go to the core of how we're structured, and we're not going to do that. I don't believe. I'm not optimistic about that. Let me put it that way. So working within, no, I don't think there's anybody with similar constraints that's doing it better. I do think we have a lot of groups that want to play in this. So you've got all the international organizations, from the International Telecommunications Union to the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. Then you've got NGOs. You've got the Moon Village Association. You've got the Washington Compact from the Hague Institute of Global Justice. You've got lots of different players that are bringing stakeholders together to talk about these issues and figure out who can come up with the best norms. And I left out the World Economic Forum. Sorry about that. There are more acronyms that want to participate and contribute in this space. And it's how do you harness, in a world where we all have very limited resources, government and industry, we can't all be everywhere. And our main ask to the US government writ large, and I say our meaning a lot of space industry, not Lockheed specifically or uniquely, is let's coordinate on venues and let's decide what do we want this venue to address and how can we use it for that? What should be here? Let's have a strategic approach to that. And I think that would help us continue to lead in space.
Dan?
I'd just say continuing to lead is a key point, and it's amazing how much ground we've lost in so many areas. There was a report led by Norm Augustine, published in 2007, I think, Rising Above the Gathering Storm. There were 48 areas of technological leadership that they thought essential, and recent analysis shows that we're behind now. China or other countries were in nowhere near we were leading in those days. We're now behind in 44 of 48. Only in space areas are we still leading. But that's where improving governance, getting a lot of the questions we're addressing here today figured out, and is the only way to win a race is to run faster than the competition. And I fear we're running slower and slower instead of running faster and faster.
I think that does assume that the competition is running the same race. which I
Yeah,
think some of our adversaries may or may not be playing by the same rules.
Oh, okay, but we have to understand the rules, yeah. But no, I mean, we should be true to our own, our values and so forth. I agree. But there are things that we know we need to do in order to lead in space, and I think we're failing in a number of those areas.
Lynna,
So I'm gonna take this conversation and pivot it slightly.
go for it.
We keep talking about a lot of its commercial space and using space for economic gain. But as you also noted, space is considered a warfighting domain these days. We have Space Force. We're talking about doing things in a cooperative environment. What happens when this turns into a warfighting domain? So what happens when someone decides that, yeah, I'm gonna go blow up somebody else's satellite because they're using that for surveillance? Now what? So we've got all these great things that work really well when we're dealing with commercial and dealing with a cooperative environment, but we have to recognize we're also dealing with an environment that very likely will turn into a warfighting domain. And what is the unintended consequences of that happening? And we talked about, previous panel mentioned you got national security exemptions for doing debris mitigation and that sort of thing potentially. Well, now we have that crossover of, we've got a lot of commercial space industry is very heavily leveraged into the national security industry. So do commercial satellites become a war-fighting target? It becomes a very interesting conversation when we change the framework that we're looking at from a cooperative, we want to get along, not turn this into a tragedy of the commons, to the fog of war. What's the fallout of that? And that's something I think as we work through these, it's understanding that this is also now becoming a war-fighting domain, and what are the potential impacts of dealing with that?
We've studied the effect of a 10 megaton bomb set off in the wrong place, and we actually did that experiment a long time ago. Somebody did, the US did. We wouldn't have to worry about so many operating spacecraft in low Earth orbit if we did that.
We would still have PNT though.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's both an EW problem and a kinetic
I
problem,
know,
right?
I know.
Well, I mean, I think, Jennifer, right, it's both an EW and a kinetic problem, right? So there's both questions.
Well, 8,000 or 12,000 communication satellites might not be operating so well.
No. Yeah, no, I'm gonna, it's fine.
Yeah. On that note, I will leave ample time for questions from the audience. So under the wiser rule, if there is a student that would like to ask a question first, students get to go first. Here we go.
There's a student.
Yo, hand the mic. There we go.
Thank you. My name is Arvind, and I work in at CU, also on trying to facilitate passive active spectrum sharing. So I want to go back to what Jennifer was talking about in terms of the economics and trying to quantify how passive stakeholders can actually, or giving it a monetary figure, I guess. So having looked into it a little bit for my own research, there are studies out there which look at, we'll tackle it as a two-pronged thing. One is for Earth remote sensing. So with respect to weather forecast, there are retrospective studies that look to degrade a forecast and by some certain amount by depriving an instrument from the data that's assimilated into a NWP model. And then they go back and then they establish, how the uncertainty tracks, say, of a hurricane might diverge, and then what impact that has economically in terms of evacuation zones and so on and so forth. So there are studies like that. And then conversely for radio astronomy, I guess one particular kind of application is if you use pulsar timing arrays for generating a timing reference, which can be used for various purposes, for precise time references. So are those not sufficient in when you said economists don't want to look into that, or are you looking for, or is the industry looking for something else that's more meaty?
So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut
No,
you
that's
off.
it, that's it. I just wanted to ask
So
you.
oftentimes there's a way to calculate the value of responsiveness from space, but not prevention. So how do you do an economic value of the prevention or the deterrence of something? Let's use national security. Maybe that's a harder one. And one, how do you put an economic value on deterrence? Because how do you measure that? How do you put an economic value on the hurricane damage that didn't happen, or loss of lives and communities that didn't happen, or flooding, et cetera? It's still a lot harder. You can put a lot of value on how quickly you were able to respond because of satellite data than all the avoidance. Avoidance is very hard to monetize, and therefore it's harder to convey to policymakers until it's not there anymore. And then oftentimes it's too late. And it goes back to something was said on the first panel, which is conservative assumptions isn't the way you should start. Conservative assumptions, you can relax and relax and relax. You can't roll back. It is very hard to claw back unless it's government sharing with government versus government sharing with industry. Because somebody will say, we paid for that under those rules, under those conditions. What are you going to give me back for clawing back the rules or the regs? It's very naive in our litigious society to suggest that.
I'll take the moderator's prerogative and also answer the question and say, like, the bottom line for passive users is that in any governance model, I don't care at what level we are talking here, international or city council, the squeakiest wheels get the grease, and passive users don't have a champion.
Yeah.
Or at least not a champion that is as economically viable or as loud or as well-heeled as other spectrum users. And
their associations.
And the bottom line is that we have looked at spectrum as a resource to create as an economic engine. And until the passive users find a way to make a better case for their uses as economic engines, they're going to suffer from the same deficit in advocacy.
AMS has been doing as good a job as possible. I think they just need more help.
For that part.
Yeah. Other questions right here?
So building directly on that question, I was curious about the role of the most passive actor of just everyday humans and how everyday humans are super impacted by what happens in space, but they're not necessarily in the room for these conversations. So where do they fall in and who is their spokesperson?
David.
I guess me. No, I think, and I'll speak as a former Fed, not as a moderator, but there are ways to get involved. There are ways for you to participate as an average human. I think the bottom line is with all spectrum-based services, I started my career working in the wireless industry, and I had a colleague that used to get asked about cell phones in the 80s when they were bag phones, and they would ask him, like, how do they work? And he'd say, they're FM. And they'd go, what's that mean? He goes, they're effing magic. Don't ask. It's just how it works. And that is how most Americans view spectrum-based services. It's just magic. They don't want to know how it works. And we all take these things for granted, and we just assume they're going to continue to inure benefit to us, that Doppler radar is going to continue to tell us where there are storm cells, that satellites in orbit are going to tell us where there's cloud cover. These are things we all take for granted because they're just part of our everyday lives. We don't think about how we get that data any more than we think about how it is that the mobile operators pump data into our pockets every day. We don't think about it, it just is. And so I think until there is a concerted effort for people to actually understand, and this is a very jaded position for me to take, but like until people care enough to understand how it works, they're not going to care enough until it's gone. And once it's gone, to Jennifer's point, you can't unwind that. It's really hard to take things back. Dan?
Well, just from the dark and quiet skies point of view, there are many people who are now seeing, in the dark regions on Earth, they're seeing satellite tracks all over the place. And, as you say, who's speaking for indigenous people who are trying to deal with this, folded into their cultural viewpoint. And so it's not only spectrum, this is affecting everyone, whether they know why or they know how. And I'm extremely concerned about that aspect, that many people don't know what they're losing until they've lost it, and it's irreparably gone.
And too often, you know, folks think because the apps are on the phone, space has nothing to do with it. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody say, well, I don't need GPS, I've got this app. I'm like, we're failing, we're so failing to communicate. But-
Even better, why do we need NOAA? I've got the
Right.
Weather Channel.
That's what
Yeah.
Congressman, no, that was Senator Ruska, I think, said that in a hearing.
Yeah.
Why, I don't need NOAA, I've got the Weather Channel, yeah.
If I could add two things for the students, there's the International Astronautical Congress. Okay, you're nodding, great. And the International Astronautical Foundation. And those organizations offer scholarships and educational opportunities for students globally. So I would encourage folks who want to have their voices heard or learn how to participate or just interested in this field, future graduates from the new Hatfield professors. Those are things, as well as AIAA. They all have presence here in the US, and I'm sure some of you know, but if others aren't, I would encourage you guys to look there.
I think the other thing I would add before we chime back in is that somebody said earlier, I think it was on the first panel, right? Like, you can't just say no. And unfortunately, so much of the scientific community has been saying no for so long instead of trying to participate in the spectrum debate that they now suffer from Chicken Little syndrome in policy circles. They've said no so many times, you'll destroy us, and then things have changed and it didn't actually destroy them, that it's difficult to regain that credibility. Unfortunately, the sky is actually falling for some of these services now, and they're finding it hard to get credibility. So, other questions from the audience?
I just want to make sure we didn't miss a topic that our government officials really aren't talking about much these days, and that's climate. Apparently it's a bad word, it's not happening. Climate change is not happening, that is. Well, it is. I'm speaking from an academic standpoint. I think a lot of people would agree with me. And we may at some point have to mitigate climate change through geoengineering. I really hope we don't. The costs are enormous. The technology isn't even there, frankly. And the science behind it is still uncertain. But it may be the only card we have to play at some point to avoid costs that have, I've seen estimates of many tens of trillions of dollars due to climate change that we could have avoided or may have to change someday. Now, how does this relate to spectrum? It relates to spectrum from the standpoint of being able to monitor what is happening during a geoengineering activity. And if you can't monitor it to within, and I won't bother to go through the basis of the number, but it's there, about a factor of 10 better, more sensitive than what we now use for weather forecasting, we won't be able to have an appropriate feedback control loop that allows us to properly implement a geoengineering method. So there's a lot at stake with regard to spectrum, in particular that little bit of spectrum that's being discussed in the recent notice.
I really hope you file comments. I'm not being flippant there. I think that's really important because so much of what we talk about in spectrum, whether it's space or any other aspect, is the today incumbents activities, not looking at the growth or what's necessary for that incumbent capability. But the commercial side, the government, look at what the government needs to evolve its capabilities to match what's happening in the world. That's often not included in the conversation.
A lot of the threats that I think we see coming are losing eyes in the sky and not being able to see whether the policy decisions we're making, the actions we're taking are beneficial or are more harmful. Possibility of doing something that has unintended consequences are very high for what you're talking about, Al.
And it's one of them, particularly when you deal with the space science community, it's a global issue. It's one of them of, it's not that the US runs all the sensors.
That's right.
That's incredibly expensive to do. We share data with all of our international partners. So the World Meteorological Organization works through and it's all right, The US has these sensors, Europe has those sensors, Japan has some other sensors. When we start having these conversations, a lot of times it's a US focused conversation. And we don't always take into account our partner nations that we're also getting data from. And we're also pulling stuff from. So it may be one of them of, hey, that band there's no US government systems operating there. Yeah, but Japan uses that and we get that data from them. And it's hard to get that folded into those conversations. The FCC looks at things from a US perspective because that's their mission. That's their focus. But when it comes to space, space is very much global. And you start having these pieces of you're having an international conversation in a domestic forum, and it gets very, very challenging.
Okay, I'm gonna follow up and say, like, beyond the government EESS, the Earth Exploration Satellite Service stuff, can you guys, any of you talk to the growth in the commercial sector and how that's helping in this space in terms of the data sets?
So putting on my old NASA hat.
I say,
but-
your old NASA job might come in handy here.
Yeah, so before coming to NTIA, I was the director of spectrum at NASA, so this is an area of passion of mine. The commercial EESS sector is a tremendous and rapidly growing portion of the space economy. And it's one of them of, I don't think people saw it coming. And right now, our regulations really don't work well with it because most of the time the EESS bands are federal allocations. We presume that it's going to be a federal incumbent that's there. But there's a lot of different innovative commercial companies which are starting to do these measurements. And it's all right, how do we protect them? And when we start having these conversations talking about repurposing, the ITU AI 1.7, one of the bands they're targeting is EESS downlinks. So, all right, and from a US perspective, that's a federal exclusive band, but we know that there are commercial operators there. So part of this is sometimes our bifurcated process causes us some challenges, but we do have other advocates, and sometimes they don't come in through the US. They may come in through another administration where they've got better standing because of our split process, and they can come in that way. But no, that's a tremendous growing sector, and it's really exciting to see what they're doing.
I think that having rather simple measurements from a lot of places is often better than having the perfect measurements from one Battlestar Galactica, you know? And so I think that, I think it was mentioned this morning, maybe by Milo or something, that if we would work more with commercial to put simple sensors on a lot of platforms, I think we would be getting a much better picture of what's happening in our world than just hoping we'll have a beautiful measurement from one point in space.
Well, we started with the challenges of dealing with commercial actors in nation-state space, and I think ending on the challenges or the benefits of commercial actors working in nation-state spaces is as good a place to end as any. So with that, if you all would please join me in thanking our panelists.